one of the reasons that finance is interesting to me for this is that if you look at what the Soviet Union was, and then when it dissolves, its economy had these holes in it, or things that a market economy has that it didn't have. Mm-hmm. And finance is one of those. I mean, if you're a centrally planned economy, banks and financial institutions are just a way of parking money, another input into production, but they aren't, and they don't have any independent validity or importance. And so their whole basis is completely different. So when Russia started creating a market economy, I mean, this was one of the main institutional deficits that they had. Yeah. And it's as opposed to, they could push back on oil and gas. I mean, they may not have had the same technology, but they certainly had an industry.
Yes.
But there was no basis for the financial industry. And so and it's an odd thing, but you can say that about the same way about there were no pizza restaurants, or there were no gyms, or somebody else I spoke to, there were no bottled water distributors. There were just certain holes that people who filled, and Americans filled in a certain way. And yes. I think that finance is one of those areas, if that makes sense to you. And that's why.
It definitely does. And I think the early contacts that we can discuss that I had were the Russian guys that were educated and following the Chicago school reform guys and trying to get up to speed on Western market reforms that we first engaged with, who were tasked to fill those holes and make the transition. So that's definitely an interesting area to discuss there.
Yeah. But just before we get to it, I know you have a strong interest in Russia and Russian politics and history. Where does that come from?
I think I just studied political science in undergrad at SUNY Albany, and I really gravitated towards enjoying the Soviet Union studies area at the time. I found it fascinating. I have a relative on my mom's side of the family who's a former U.S. ambassador. His name's Edward Juragin, and he currently heads the James Baker School of Public Policy at Rice University, having set it up with Secretary Baker 25 plus years ago. Uh-huh. And so I'm Armenian by ethnicity on my mom's side. She was born in France, but so that was a really strong part of it. And his kind of focus on that part of the world. He was mostly Middle East, but also did some work in Russia. It was in my mind. So when undergrad, I wanted to study it. I enjoyed the teacher I had at the time, Eric Hoffman. And so when I moved to Boston and started working, I went to grad school part-time and also gravitated to the classes that had Eastern Europe and transition. So because we were investing in the transition economies at work, and then I could study the whole thing from the political side. And I loved the region and the background of it all.
And did you speak Armenian at home?
No, in fact, my mom with her brothers, they spoke French at home, but my dad was kind of a typical American and kind of dissuaded her from speaking anything. So I listened to them speak French, don't really speak any of it. And she basically, when they got into arguments, she'd speak Armenian with my grandmother and my uncle when they would fight on things. So I learned some broken Russian to get myself to meetings in Russia if I had to go by myself. I certainly always was glad to have a translator help in a meeting or a Russian official that spoke English, but unfortunately I didn't have a native proclivity for the language.
Yeah. So when was the first time that you went to Russia or the Soviet Union?
Actually, it was right after graduating college. A friend and I, we did one of those Ural Pass trips, but we did a week in 1988 to Leningrad and Moscow for a week. It was a week or a little bit more. So that was my first trip. I got to see the end of it.
I see. Yeah.
which was quite good on a Sputnik sponsored tour there. So that was my first time, as a post undergrad. And then for work, the early 90s, it probably would have been 92 or 93 was the first business trip, as Russia was coming on the scene with the aforementioned restructuring of its debt obligations and opening up at that time. The GKO market, it was basically the loans for shares, all those vouchers. People were getting interested in that. So right around that time, it probably was 92, 93. Yeah.
So Fidelity was interested. Fidelity followed these developments in Russia and was interested in them.
I would say we have had an equity division and a bond division in the fixed income area, which would be investing in government obligations and then the corporate sector. Yeah. Within that, in our global research team, they were mostly allocating their time to develop Europe, G7, OECD countries. But as the emerging markets opportunities started coming into the fold, they allocated research and portfolio management time towards basically building those products and getting up to speed in that area. So within a subset of our global research team, we had the developed guys, and I spent half my time between both until I went full-time to emerging markets. So we wanted to have a view and investment recommendations for the fund managers. At that time, they would have been relegated to just the funds that were approved to invest in those higher risk regions. And we were, my colleague at the time was launching a brand new emerging markets fund at Fidelity, which was called the New Markets Income Fund. So we started it from scratch. And so a lot of the funds would go into that, but some of the other global funds would be allowed to have a small piece of Russia. So I always tried to explain to people I met in Russia that the firm didn't necessarily care one way or the other about Russia, but within the groups, if we felt there were investment opportunities, you could allocate your time to it. So I always spent an inordinate amount of time because I was interested in it and felt there were a good, reasonable risk return profile. Right. So if I said I needed to go to Russia, I hardly got any pushback. Bulgaria, Romania, the same type of thing. I try to limit how many times I'd go to those other places that felt I could, come away with fresh information. But I thought Russia and some other places, more frequent travel made sense.
Yeah. What did that mean? How frequently?
So when I was based in Boston, it was probably just once per year until I moved over to London in 1996, and then I went at least once a quarter, and sometimes maybe twice in a quarter if there was something going on. It would be based there would be like an investment conference that I could go and see a lot of companies presenting, and then set up a bunch of private meetings on the side to go visit regions and do those things that way. So it was a lot easier. And then of course you're in the same time zone. The phone calls would be much easier and all those things. So it stepped up in the 95, 96 time period when I relocated to the London office.
So going back to the loans for shares and GKO period, how did you view that at the time? How did you view the loans for shares, and how did you view it as an investment opportunity?
I'd say I always had a very healthy dose of cynicism and concern about most of those investments. Some of my colleagues at the time, so I would have been a junior analyst working with more experienced economists and financial analysts in the research side, and our clients, so to speak, internally were the portfolio managers that wanted investment opportunities and wanted to know about these things. So a lot of them would hear, you can buy these companies for, kopecks on the ruble. I want to get them into my funds, go figure out how to do it. And then we'd speak to our legal teams and our compliance and back office teams. And I would say was always very lucky to work at Fidelity. They had very solid infrastructure. So there'd be a legal person and a custody and settlement people. And I talked to them and they'd say, "Are you crazy? There's no repository for these things. You can't prove settlement." We heard the stories of, some of the share repositories being burned down, registries going missing or, forfeited.
Yeah.
Fake ones. So I had to be the one to come back and say, these are not ready for prime time. You can't really invest in it from a compliance point of view. We're 40 Act and regulatory, guidelines for these mutual funds. You can't invest in some of these things. So they were always waiting for the investment banks to come up and structure some of these things. And even then, we couldn't really get an ability to invest in some of those early things like Renaissance Capital and other. But actually, CSFB was the first Western European entity that would package some of these vouchers into, investment vehicles, but they still didn't pass muster from our legal and compliance teams. And then eventually there was some, the restructured debt we could start investing in. So I was very cynical. Yes, they look like great returns, but then the problem was you weren't sure were you going to get your money back at all. And then from a research perspective, with some of my mentors on the team, we also understood it just didn't make sense from when we try to analyze a country, we want to make sure we understand the entire picture, not just what the government says it's going to do, but its ability to maintain a social transition and a sustainable economic and polity. And you have a bunch of people that have been working their whole lives who suddenly had their investments decimated, and they're going to be given vouchers that were not really worth anything because there was no market for them, and they were forced to either sell them for the stories of a bottle of vodka or fresh vegetables, and then these red managers would grab them up and then accumulate stocks of these things. And so it just seemed very rushed and suspect about the way it happened, and we weren't sure about the sustainability of it in the early days. Yeah. So I should stop there for a moment there before I do it all in one breath, the next part. So I think I was cynical early on, trying to push back about which things are possible. Then we realized the defaulted, you've gone through the difference between the London Club and the Paris Club debt stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So that stuff became tradable in our markets. The defaulted loans were then trading, and we were able to buy those.
Soviet loans?
Yes. So the Paris Club was the nomenclature for the official debt loaned between government to government. Yeah. That was restructured in those bilateral negotiations, or sometimes multilateral. The London Club was the nickname for the commercial debt that was lent out of the banks in London that default and New York that were defaulted, and those banks brought them out of their books, and they ended up started trading on the secondary market as basically recoverable loans. Like you can buy them, and their prospects would rise and fall with the ability of the Russian government to acknowledge and restructure the debt. So early on, you could buy a defaulted loan that would have no interest bearing on it at all, in the hopes that as the government tried to re-engage with the West and get new financing, they would own up to the obligations, and before getting new debt, had to figure out how to treat this old debt. And then sometimes there were like significant returns on these things as the prospects improved. Like right. You'd have equity-like upsides. In bonds, you're usually talking single-digit returns. You'd have healthy double-digit returns on some of these instruments in short periods of time as the prospects improved. So we did own in the emerging markets funds the defaulted debt of Eastern European countries, and then when each of those countries went through a Brady type restructuring, they were repackaged into actually fully functioning bonds that had interest bearing options or principal without interest. You could split the bonds up so that it became a fully functioning. Russia never entered an official Brady bond program. Poland, Bulgaria did, some other ones. They just did it on their own and issued new Ministry of Finance bonds as well, which we invested in it also. Right.
Let me go back to a minute to the loans for shares. So a lot of that was designed by Americans, and particularly people from Harvard. While that was going on, did you interact with the people from Harvard, or how did you view the development of that program itself? And were you a passive observer, or did you try to sort of get a little more of the inside information about it, or what?
I'd say so. Some of the people I work with were of the similar stature in terms of either, academic PhDs that were involved with our firm, or have worked in Wall Street for people that would circulate in and out of government, who could be like treasury officials. So some of my mentors had worked at Bear Stearns. Their bosses were treasury officials. Actually, one of them was Larry Kudlow, who just was in the last administration. They often would go back and forth to Russia to advise the government, and do fishing trips and what are you guys trying to do? So they circulated in those circles, and then I would maybe go along to some of these meetings as a junior analyst to be involved at first. So my particularly strong mentor, a gentleman by the name of Tim Carney, was very critical of the shock therapy that Professor Sachs had advocated for Poland. One, because Tim was Polish by descent on one of his parents' side, spoke Polish and spent time there, and he kind of knew that the shock therapy was going to decimate the country. And in fact, as you know the story, the inflation went, and it actually set people back in many years in terms of wanting to even reform it all. They lost savings, they couldn't afford everything. As it went towards Russia, there wasn't a specific shock therapy program that came from Harvard, but it was like Andre Schleifer and Jonathan
Hay.
Jonathan
Hay. HIID.
And I think I met one or both of them through it was either an agency or a ministry that Anatoly Chubais was the privatization administration.
Yeah.
So I remember meeting one or two of them there on a trip to Russia, and I found it very interesting early on. There was a U.S. Treasury person that was seconded there. There was a German ministry official seconded there that were advising, that we'd meet on and off with. Then the names would change over time, but I remember those meetings in there. And Dmitry Vasilyev early on. So we can go over those names later to make sure they're all the right ones.
Right.
And they discussed the loans for shares program there and how it was going to work. I remember Chubais saying, either he said it publicly, but often repeated it like in private meetings. We need to get these shares as quickly as possible out of the hands of these communist, managers into the market, so that this creative destruction can happen and we can get these things going. Obviously, there were fits and starts with it and mixed success, but early on, we just felt the market infrastructure might not have been developed enough for the workers to get their fair share in what was going to happen. In order for it to be sustainable, like obviously employee share programs weren't even developed in the U.S. at the time, so to say they should have it there. But I remember those early days, and we were very critical about like the sustainability of it, and its success.
Yeah.
But we didn't invest in any of those early on. But I know many of my peers who I'd be traveling to Russia with, they would try to invest in those because they felt they were going to have pretty outsized returns.
But because at that point there were no exchanges, so so those shares were trading through some of the early Russian focused banks, or how are they trading?
Apparently, I mean, first there were competing registries or registrars. I'm not sure what the right word is.
Right.
In the regions and even within Moscow. But we actually heard stories of like the investment banks would send people out, including young Americans with their Russian counterparts, Americans who spoke Russian. The investment banks would send them out to the regions with cash to stand at the corner of these companies and be like, have a sign, we're buying vouchers. And people would come up and do so. Actually, have some friends who they once removed that they were involved in doing that early on. Then, of course, the companies themselves would set up their own, ability to buy the shares into a window. So that was a big problem before the first actual exchanges picked up in Moscow. It was on the streets, on the street corners.
Yeah. And so you were looking at investment banks saying to you, we can gain control of this or that industrial enterprise, and do you want to join in it?
Yeah, some of them would be, we can grab as many as we can, and we can either package them up into so it would be a note. You would purchase a note. I'm just guessing by example, like a Credit Suisse note, that, giving you pass-through exposure to an underlying Russian company. So let's say if it was Lukoil, it would be a Credit Suisse linked note to a Lukoil share that was somewhere in Russia. That our legal team would be like, well, which registrar is it? Can I have any, DTC settlement? And we all just were like, this is actually insane. If you held it and it went up and you can, you trade out of it, it's fine. The problem was if there was ever a push comes to shove and you tried to put the instrument back to the broker, they wouldn't guarantee a market in those early days. So it was a one-way thing. They'd be happy to sell it to you. It's like the Robinhood thing now. It was a one-way trade.
Yeah.
So you stuck with this thing. And so it just never passed muster. I mean, our firm tended to be a little bit more milquetoast at the end of kind of investment offerings in the space. There were a lot of boutique investment emerging market funds that were happy with the risk, had different regulations, and could skirt in and out of it. We were more like a battleship that takes long.
Right. But you were interested enough. They were interested enough to allow you to pay attention to it.
Oh, definitely. And I think I probably spent an inordinate amount of time because I thought it was important to understand the journey of where they were going. And we were lucky in the early days. I think it was 92 or 93. Some friends of mine work at a company called Transnational Research. It's an investment boutique firm with a broker attached to it. And they would go and find like interesting people in different in emerging markets and bring them to the U.S. to meet investors instead of us always going. And then we'd go there also. But early on, we had Anatoly Chubais and Dmitry Vasilyev, his kind of partner in crime. They came to the United States. They were in D.C. and they came to probably New York and Boston. And we had a very interesting. In the early days, Chubais came in with literally a pocket protector. Like my dad used to work for IBM, and I had one of those old IBM pocket protectors in a short sleeve white shirt, like a totally nerdy guy, lanky, redheaded guy with broken English, but very smart. And and I had these like staid New England portfolio managers, and they're trying to speak the same language. And at one point, the guy, this one manager said, "Well, what's the interest rate on a car loan?" And Chubais laughed, and I answered, and I said, "The interest rate is, 10 years." I tried to answer like in a Dada-esque way, like
right,
because they didn't understand. Like Chubais laughed. It's like there's no concept of the time value of money, and you're not going to buy anything. So, no mortgages, all those things. Right. So it took a long time to get up to speed to speak the same language for those people.
Yeah. So did that begin to? I'll tell you just a quick story. I have to tell you this quick story, a personal experience. I'll give you a chance to drink your drink. I had a Russian friend who was a lawyer for oh God, I just blanked on it. GUM.
Oh yeah, okay.
And GUM early on listed shares at the Frankfurt Exchange, and I think this must have been a few years later than what you're talking about. Not much later. And GUM had a network of 17 stores, warehouses, plus the store there in Red Square. Mm-hmm. And he figured out that he could, on the Russian exchange and the Frankfurt exchange, if you did it right, you could purchase GUM for thousands of dollars. Because it was pennies. The shares were trading for pennies.
Yes.
And we put together a proposal to do that. And I came back and met with an investment fund here in Boston. And they looked at it and they said, technically, yes, we could do it, but we know that Lushkov would never allow foreigners to purchase GUM. And so, but it was sort of part of the spirit of that time. If you can imagine, it's like a heist.
Yes. Absolutely. I wonder, was it Battery March or?
No, I'm trying to remember. The guy, it was a small firm. The guy I actually spoke to later, people I knew told me that they thought he was a spook, but.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think who that could have been, but, or which firm it was. Maybe it'll come to us, because,
yeah, it will come to us, but, I didn't take it any further after that, so, I mean, because the logic of what he said made sense to me that, that Lushkov would never allow it to slip out from control. But the economics of it were such that logically it could have happened.
Oh, definitely. At one point, I remember I was still on the debt side of the investment world, and I traveled with a colleague of mine that looked at companies, and we went on an investment trip to St. Petersburg, and I'm going to forget the name of the engine and tractor works there, but we just did a random meeting, and it turned out the market cap of this company was probably like $12 million, and it made no sense.
Yeah.
Made no sense at all given the volume of output and its importance. And a lot of those opportunities came up, but we didn't really have a chance to do.
Right. Because they wouldn't fit within your regulatory requirements, right?
Yeah, we couldn't find a way to get access that we couldn't hold the shares directly. It would have to be through a broker, and then it was a little too circuitous for the compliance teams.
Right. So did things change when the exchanges started to be developed in Russia? Did they change for you?
Yeah, we also did. There are different investment alliances of investors that kind of pool their efforts to go and meet with officials and say, look, we all do the same thing. We'd love to invest here. Here are the kind of mundane back office things we need. We need settlement, clearance, all these things. One was the Russell 2020 group that a lot of firms in Boston, including ours, was a member of. And it's not so much lobbying as like, here's what we need, and if you need help from us, we can facilitate conversations. You can speak to our back office people, and a lot of those conversations went very well. Those groups and others would have pushed, including the brokers, pushed to have ADRs or GDRs established, because those we could purchase. So that made it much easier. Once there was a Lukoil ADR and a Gazprom ADR, then we were good, because then we work with Bank of New York to, they would be the depository receipt holder, and the story from there. So
I purchased ADRs, so I know.
Great. Yeah. So that made it very easy. And then the same thing on the bond side. Once things were traded in different markets and they were issuing new debt or repackaged debt, then it just became about the analysis. But along the way,
who were you talking to about that? Who were you talking to? Ministry of Finance?
So we would have relationships in every relevant agency. So the central bank would have people that we would talk to in terms of foreign exchange issues, and they were very open and interested in how that would work. And the privatization agency would handle a lot of it on the Russian side. And then there was even a German guy who worked in the Ministry of Finance at the time that was advising the government, and a lot of those top line issues on the debt side we talked to with him. So we had avenues in to speak to them. And I think then the IMF, the World Bank, would be there as resources. The investment arm of the World Bank, the IFC, they would also have like technical market infrastructure stuff. And then the brokers themselves on the ground wanted to sell this stuff. So they helped get the Russians up to speed and put people in touch. So appetite was there from the investor. The logistics and kind of relationship building came through the brokers. The Russian side would have their governmental contacts with the U.S. SEC to the extent that existed, and the different exchanges. The exchanges themselves sent people because they wanted to do business. So there was even a couple of scandals along the way, right, with the Bank of New York, with Russia, because there were Russians working at the Bank of New York and issues with some of the money, but everybody was in there trying to advocate for things to change. So it just became easier over time. We never stopped pushing for improvements in terms of like days to settle cash, the timing of foreign exchange settlement versus the share settlement, because sometimes it would be a big risk. But we usually pressed that through the brokers to make them change it. And then we would just tell the Russians, until this changes, we can't really invest in it. We'd like this, but we tried to use the fulcrum through the people we traded the shares through.
Right. So at the time, was it your sense that it was only a matter of time before Russia began to mirror Western investment regimes such that they would be integrated into the world kind of financial systems on roughly similar mechanisms and terms?
I do recall there was a very heady zeitgeist of the whole thing, right? I felt it was probably the Bush senior administration, right, when they were like, everybody go to Russia. Like, I felt like there was a big wave of people going over to try to open them up after the wall fell. And so it felt like you were part of a private army that was trying to help extend the foreign government embrace of Russia from the private angle, the way you were involved also.
Yeah.
But I felt like we knew it was going to be fits and starts. And there were a lot of signs of how this thing wouldn't be streamlined. First of all, we had the fights within the Russian government itself, including Yeltsin sending tanks against the parliament. We had the failed putsch, investing through all that. And then I think it was the 1993 elections that went really badly for the reformers, right?
Yeah.
And we had Chubais and Vasiliev back in Boston, I think, trying to explain what the outlook was. And then the Duma just became crazy. I remember going to the Duma a couple times to meet different people, and it felt like walking through the bar scene in Indiana Jones, like where like there'd be delegatia, like you'd have some Duma member from Omsk, and he'd have like 20 people behind him with, just crazy. And then Zhirinovsky's LDPR guys somehow got the job of security. So at the door of the Duma, there'd be a Russian soldier and then some guy in a black leather jacket and jeans who'd be like patting you down, because people were carrying guns into the Duma. Like, it was crazy. So the relationship was always like, the Duma is going to extract as much pain and money out of the government as it can to get what it wants. It was always a game of brinksmanship and prisoner's dilemma. And so we'd go meet with these officials, and including the Western interlopers, like this German official, and ask, like, well, what's going on? What's the inside baseball? And I remember saying, like, if they don't pass this particular law, they're not going to get the IMF lending. If they don't get the IMF lending, the ruble's going to collapse. And then, and the guy, I remember on one particular vote that was important, he said, I mean, in the end of the day, what's a few hundred laptops distributed amongst Duma members to get the vote to go the right way? Like, we'll just bribe them. And it felt extremely cynical. And I was like, this is not sustainable. And then I remember hearing people special plead, like, can't Yeltsin just pass a decree?
Yeah.
Well, as we see, the decrees last as long as until the next guy comes in, and you reverse it. And also getting the decree to actually work its way through the system. So I decree that foreign investors are going to be treated on the same level as Russian ones. Okay, well, I just got screwed. What ministry do I go to have my hearing? Oh, there is none. So the early days we heard the rhetoric at the top level, but saw what was going on the ground.
Yeah.
And we're very concerned along the way the fits and starts nature of it. And that's why there would be like sideways moves, and then there'd be some reform enthusiasm, and then the bonds would rally from like the low 30s and 40s up towards par. Equities would rise, and so it was definitely a euphemistic, enthusiastic time.
Yeah.
And up and down with roller coaster rides though all the time. But I was always very concerned. I tried to when I did political science research, we always tried to remember, don't fall afoul of normative bias. It's like this in Boston, so it better be like this in Moscow. So I'd go there and say, like, well, this U.S. advice doesn't really make any sense. Like, well, we don't do that at home. Why are we asking them to do this here? And is it going to be sustainable? How much political capital can they burn through in Russia to get something done until they lose it? If you lose all the pensioners, you lose the next election.
Right.
So, but you can't just chuck the pensioners out, and you can't devalue the ruble. So we hear all these like conflicting pieces of information, and going to meet the IMF resident rep or the World Bank resident rep and get their perspective. It just was really crazy. Often,
so you were getting different kinds of advice from different Westerners.
Yes.
And going to different parts of the Russian government.
Yes, and there were enthusiastic reformers in the government, like Chubais and his team. Before I can say he became a bit more cynical later on when he ended up being CEO of Unified Energy Systems. I think he started to become a bit more cynical. But early on, he was enthusiastic. He and Boris Nemtsov obviously were the golden boys working for Yeltsin. And he did feel, and you could feel the enthusiasm, like we have to beat these communists because we have a window here. We need to. And during the election when Yeltsin was trying to be reelected, I remember like just no holds barred from Chubais. Like, you don't understand. We can't backslide. We have to win this at all costs. So they were dedicated to the reform effort. And we sat down with Gaidar was full of less bravado, but he was very intellectual, and he would sit down and explain everything early on to what they were trying to do and the reforms they were trying to pass. I think Yavlinsky had perhaps failed to do that under the Gorbachev regime because he was kind of either senior economic advisor or maybe was he deputy prime minister for a short time under Gorbachev?
He might have been. Yeah, you may be right. Yeah.
And so I felt like Gaidar was more market savvy, less intellectual about how to do it, more practical. And I felt like those were really good people you could ally with and talk to, and they wanted the investment. They wanted the pressure from the outside to get things to change in Russia. At the same time, they were Russians and they were very proud. So some of the people like Dubinsky at the central bank,
right?
Actually, he was in the Ministry of Finance at the beginning, and he became central bank governor later. But I was in plenty of meetings with him where he was definitely a very proud Russian, as well as understanding that there was a job to do. But just felt a lot of the people who were interacting with the Russians were younger Americans who, had their own market and political shibboleths about our country, and not even appreciating the journey that Russia was going through itself in its transformation, versus the collapse of its empire,
right?
Then particular issues of Russians itself, and then the Russian economy and the relationships. I just felt like they came in, made a lot of demand, and the West always held expectations up and would be late to deliver, and then it just felt like a constant wooing of the Russians to get something done. There was always a fire drill, like you have to pass this law to get this money before this happens, and it just seemed like a treadmill. And until Putin came in, I felt like Yeltsin was just a political figure who meant well and then became probably a little destructive. I think Putin just was the more practical, emotionless, or good at controlling his emotions kind of person. Right. And to be honest, he was very constructive towards the reform efforts in the early days in terms of like stabilizing everything. I think
Right.
he's I don't try to read his mind, but I think I understand why they've become much more cynical or less enthusiastic to engage in efforts to the West. Given that we've asked them to do a number of things, they did, and then we turned a corner as much as they do.
Right. Right.
So it's too bad. I think we missed this window of solidifying the Russian efforts, and it's probably as much from U.S. political decisions as anything else. Obviously, the NATO expansion,
Right.
misunderstandings about what was said, what wasn't said, what was written down, what wasn't written down.
Yeah. So by the mid '90s, I'm still back in the mid '90s. Did Fidelity actually begin to invest?
We had, yes, in our emerging markets funds, we definitely held debt, and in our new emerging market equity funds, which were specifically risk tailored to hold those things, we held Russian shares.
Yeah.
Still probably ADRs and GDRs until until later into the 90s, when we were able to own local Russian shares in Russia and other emerging markets. So our back office team built all the infrastructure we needed, along with the brokers, to be able to trade and settle local shares. We always wanted to do local anyway, wherever we could.
Yeah.
And because usually those markets were a little bit more, were often more liquid, and it just made more sense. So
right.
It took a little. It wasn't the early '90s. It was probably mid to late '90s when we were able to start owning equities, when our new funds started, and then the debt side was earlier because it was.
I want to talk about the GKOs, but first I want to ask you about Norilsk.
Yeah.
And so, when did you get involved in Norilsk? And I want you, if you could, just talk about your visits there and relationship with Norilsk.
Yeah, I got very involved in the corporate governance aspect of investing in emerging markets, which we could discuss later. But that was one of the reasons why I ended up going to Norilsk. It was a good case study in a restructuring of a Russian company and the risks and opportunities for an investor. Now, early on, our funds were not invested in Norilsk. And if I recall correctly, the Russian companies, when they set themselves up, there was a holding company on top of the production company, right? And then they all made this transformation because people were concerned. There was the management was using the holding company to asset strip or move assets below, so you could have this really profitable piece of the company, and then they'd be having a hotel chain or some of this stupid stuff. So they all did a transformation where they moved the holding company to underneath the production aspect, the main asset of the company. And Norilsk, a lot of the investors took bets on owning some of the different parts of the company. And when they folded this in, there was a little bit of controversy at why it was done at whatever discount it was done at. There was a bit of an uproar. Now, luckily, we didn't own any of it, so I was more concerned from like a sustainability piece. But when Norilsk made its transformation, its holding company cleared that up, and then we were able to buy the Norilsk GDRs. It would have been just GDRs at the time. I went on a trip with an investment bank and a bunch of other investors to go see the assets. So we spent time in Moscow meeting at the headquarters.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was very strange. I believe Prokhorov was the CEO of the company at the time, or was it?
It's him and Patanin, I think.
Yeah, Patanin, exactly. So Patanin was the CEO. You couldn't really meet with them much because they would come and maybe speak at an investor conference, but they were a little bit standoffish. You'd always ended up meeting like the investor relations team, and it was very difficult to meet an actual CFO or COO at the company. You met the IR team. Whereas at Norilsk, we met the chief accountant, we met the CEO, we met all the regular management people in addition to the IR team. So it was a bit standoffish. So they allowed us to do a trip because they wanted to have people invest in the company. because it was a closed city, we had to get, whatever proper FSB permissioning.
Right.
And they chartered a plane, the broker chartered a plane, and we flew up there with so a lot of my competitors, but we invested together to learn. So we flew up on the plane together. There was weather windows to get in and all this stuff.
Yeah. Who was the broker that took you up?
I think the first time it might have been Bernie's Troika Dialogue. It might have been the first trip that I did up there. So Troika Dialogue arranged the trip.
And then this was in the mid-90s?
This was closer to the late 90s or early 2000s, I think.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And maybe the late 90s. And when we landed, met by a Norilsk bus, and basically our local FSB minders in the little black car followed us around, and we went to the Norilsk hotel in town, and then the next day did trips to the copper smelter, to the mine. We went down in the mine, and all this was just unbelievable. You're walking through the Smithsonian Institute of Russian Industry, right? So
yeah,
we a lot of us knew the sad legacy of Norilsk being a prison labor, camp. And
thing. Yeah,
my Russian teacher in London, her father was sent there, and he died there after a number of years. So I even had people who had a personal connection. You could see the heavy pollution in the town, but people were flocking to go to Norilsk because they were paying cash.
Yeah.
At some point, we could talk about the arrears in the system too, if that's interesting or relevant to your story. But Norilsk could pay people, so people were trying to get into Norilsk to work, even if it was $200 or $300 a month, whatever it was a lot of money. And so we'd go around to all the different production facilities. We'd meet the managers. Now, at the time, Norilsk was still under state secret in terms of their production because they had palladium and platinum.
Yeah.
And so we're all working to get the Russian government to declassify certain parts of its palladium and platinum stockpiles so we could understand what Norilsk was doing. But Norilsk was still under this kind of umbrella. So we had to kind of reverse engineer, working with some people at the company and others have to, what's the capacity of this machine? How much do you do each year? That does copper, that does this. And then try to build these financial models. And everyone made, I think, significant amounts of money in Norilsk because if you invested at the right time when the holding structure situation was taken care of, you had a clarity in what the company produced, what its stockpiles were, could put a value on that, and then the metals themselves started to rally in the 90s from copper and palladium across the board, including nickel, and it became a great proxy. It's one of the largest nickel swing producers in the world. Yeah. And it was great. But we traveled to the dock to see, this ice locked port, Judinka, I think it was.
Yeah.
We got to go see that they have the nuclear icebreakers that come and open up the port. So just an amazing kind of legacy of Soviet investment and industry there. And I ended up going back again for myself on another trip, probably a year later, to see where things changed. And then my last trip would have been to take a colleague who was going to take over being the person responsible for covering the metals and mining section of Russia. I didn't want her to go alone. So I went with her and a bunch of other people, and we went up and did another one of these trips.
Right.
To meet the same people and see where things were at.
So
I spent a lot of time on that, but that kind of example, I think we did for many companies in emerging markets. Fidelity's kind of model was we go out and kick the tires of companies, whether it was people going to visit Pep Boys when they first started in the U.S. and nobody would go visit them, in Peter Lynch's era, to going to, the Arctic Circle to see Norilsk nickel to see if it's really there.
Yeah. And Norilsk, as I remember, was one of it was, of course, heavy polluter, dirty,
yes,
offender in all ways, but then it was subject to all these restructuring and reform with the idea of getting Western investment. I mean, it was pretty clear from the beginning. I mean, because I know ADRs were pretty early on. I remember one of Harvard used to hold those Russian investment conferences. Did you go to those?
Were they Boston based?
Yeah, yeah, they
I,
were
I
in Cambridge.
I may have caught one before.
And there was a Norilsk CFO spoke there, and he
Interesting.
showed, the progress of the shares, and I ran home and convinced my Schwab broker that I don't care what you say, I
I
want
want
to
to buy
buy
some.
these ADRs, and I paid for some addition of the house with that. But
Fantastic.
you know, but they wouldn't touch it. But I think early on they were kind of restructuring and eyeing Western investment. Is that your sense as well?
I think they actually didn't need the Western know-how, so to speak, until I believe some of the Scandinavian countries were willing to provide some of the technology on scrubbers and those things to deal with the acid rain
Uh-huh.
situation, which was a real thing. When I went there, I got a greater appreciation. They literally had these giant sulfur stockpiles of bricks of sulfur that they
Uh-huh.
would come out at the end of the process. But there was an issue of ability to retrofit the existing stacks with scrubber technologies, and it was almost like the company was always financially on the edge for a long time. So it became like, how long do you run these assets to accumulate wealth until you invest in it? Like, is it sustainable enough that we want to invest X amount of money in it, or are the metals prices going to collapse again, and we should just cynically run this as much as we can and let the pollution go as it may?
Right.
So I think before the advent of ESG matrix of investing, I think we all said, you really need to have a plan for this, because there'll be intergovernmental issues in terms of you can't keep polluting up here because it's up in this ecosystem up here,
Yeah.
and you probably don't want to do it because Russian labor laws might change and all those things. So I think they always had very good Scandinavian equipment. So when I went to the different parts of it, you'd see, I forget the name of the companies, but you'd see Russian processing machines, and then you'd see whatever the relevant Scandinavian ones that were doing similar mining would be there. So they had those things. They had the energy situation sorted themselves because they had natural gas and all those things up there. So I think Norilsk was more of a stable, getting the company to become stable rather than we don't have the know-how. Now the problem was Patanin and then Prokhorov afterwards. They were so probably more Patanin. It was so political. He was involved in the loans for share scheme, and I felt like they stole these companies. Obviously, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Having been a former trade minister, they had access and lobbying power, and I just felt the government. They loaned money to the government. The government reneged on it, and then they got the share. So,
right.
And then they're like, "Oh, we're the owners. The benefits are going to accrue to us rather than the workers or the shareholders at that time." So we all went through that journey together.
Yeah.
There were some other companies like VSM. Is it VSMP? No, there's another metals company in Russia that I'll remember, or I'll email after if I can't remember the name. But when I went to visit them, they do smelting, copper, those things too. Maybe not nickel. It was night and day in terms of safety. Walking on the floor at Norilsk, we had to put a hard hat on, and we were walking out in the smelter area. But there's like sulfuric acid you're breathing in.
Yeah.
So the workers, there'd be women like loading these diodes into the electrolysis sections, and they'd be wearing like clothing from home with their hair in a kerchief, bending over. And all day long, you're basically in the most sensitive part of your body. You're inhaling sulfuric acid. You could see it. And
Yeah.
one of the guys on the IR team, a Russian guy, actually refused to go through there without a gas mask on. Like, I felt like I'm going to walk through for the 8 minutes and not worry about it, as
Right.
the Russians did. And the managers there didn't care because not to be to generalize, but Russians have this thing like with radiation and stuff. If you can't see it, it doesn't hurt you.
Right. Right.
I was like, well, these people are working here, and then I just remember seeing it wasn't very safe. Or a guy pulling out, molten material with gloves on, but like a Saturday night shirt, like no smock or anything. And so, but I went to other parts of Russia, and the companies didn't stand for that. They had rules like if you went out on the floor without your hard hat and stuff, you were off the floor unpaid. And there were not only the signs that said that, they actually enforced it. And then I realized the good thing is, if you enforce it, the workers would be like, I think it's it's like girly man stuff, but if I don't do it, I'm not gonna be able to work. So we have to do it. You can always blame the man. But in the realist, it wasn't enforced. So if you did it, you were like, "Are you a jerk?"
Yeah.
Trying to wear the safety clothes. Now you're gonna make us wear. So the other companies just turned it around and made the change. And I just felt the management of Norilsk was stuck back in Moscow. You had the production managers who were very competent.
Yeah.
And knew what they were doing, but it's very Soviet. When we went down the mine in the Nadezhda complex, that freaked me out a little bit because you got your little pack in case there was a problem in the mine, and we were joking that in there was a Bible and a little small flask of vodka, But what's in there is this breathing device that gives you, I guess, like 40 minutes of ability to breathe oxygen.
Yeah.
That thing you put in, but it causes these horrible, burns in your face when you use it. But it allows you to breathe, to create oxygen by breathing through this thing, so you can get to an open part of the mine.
Wow.
And while we were down there, like there was machinery moving around, and even we walked in this one area where they just had done some explosives, and the whole air was filled with like a smoke. And they're like, "You guys better stop drilling. We have investors coming," and I was like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Going down underneath. But that gave me a good perspective of the toil that the Russian, workers went through. I've never done a similar thing in the U.S. company to go actually see how they work and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. But did it make you feel as an investor more wanting to invest in the company that had the safety?
Oh, for sure. Different levels of risk. So I've said that as Norilsk improves their standards, you can have a multi-lift in both the sustainability of the company and the returns. Right. These other companies are going to have fewer accidents, and it's just better, more Western oriented in terms of the risk. Because whenever there was a problem, it could be a political problem, right? If they weren't investing properly in safety, and there's a mine problem, then it becomes like Putin hears about it, and then they arrest the CEO. So
right, yeah.
If you actually don't do those kinds of investments, it has longer term problems. So I just noted it in terms of the difference, and sometimes it was reflected in the share price, and sometimes not.
Right, but it's interesting that they were oriented towards pleasing you, showing you things. I mean, they were definitely wanting to become integrated then.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I think some of the oil companies were the most recalcitrant in terms of they were very proud Russian companies.
Yeah.
The Lukoil guys, the Surgut as well, because this elusive guy Bogdanov would only appear once in a while. And a funny story, one time I went on a Russian region oil trip, and we met with the CFO of Surgut in Moscow, and we were going to fly all the way to Surgut to meet Bogdanov because he refused to come to Moscow to see us. So we had to this. The first leg of the trip was there. We got there, flew overnight, had to go to this giant auditorium with a dais. It was almost like it was a governmental building. And we're waiting, and there was like 20 investors were sitting around waiting. Surgut people running back and forth. We knew something was wrong. They come around this, and the CFO who we had just met with, flown up there with us also, he gets up and he goes, "We're very sorry, Mr. Bogdanov was called to a very important meeting in Moscow, and he left this morning."
Oh.
So we don't even know if he did, but they personally just kicked us in the harness again. Like, you're not going to, we won't make ourselves. So you can ask us more questions to the CFO, and we have the production manager. We got to do a little bit of a tour to see some production and those things, but it was that kind of thing. Some companies were better than others in trying to help you. Like, you'd meet a FO at Lukoil, and they try to take the reports out and go through the numbers because we had no information. We had like a year and a half old annual report published in Russian only, in Russian accounting standards. We'd have to go to Russia to ask for a copy of that, and then you'd sit there with your notebook and say, "What's the last disclosed numbers you gave out?" And like, don't give me the undisclosed ones, but I need to find out what's going on. And it was crazy. But now Russia has, as with all emerging markets, quarterly international accounting standards reporting, as well as Russian accounting standards. They pay taxes under Russian accounting standards, and they report IAS. You can go on the website and get both. So
when did that begin to happen?
That started to get much better in the early 2000s.
Early 2000s?
Yeah, it started to pick up in terms of availability of that stuff.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
That investor calls, so everybody could get the information at the same time. Otherwise, you have to fly there and get it. Before I forget, so one other anecdote, because I may have put in, relates to shares and the experience and the give and take. I got to do a lot of things because our senior management just couldn't, Russia wasn't a priority, but the Russians would be like, "Can you send the CEO of your company over?" And that just would never happen.
Yeah.
So I went in the place, and one time our senior legal counsel in Boston got invited through somebody in Washington to be part of an IFC trip to Russia to do one of their meetings, and he's like, I can't do it. Do you know anybody in the London office that can go? And they asked me like, "Are you going?" So I scheduled a trip around it. So I got to go sit with the guy who was appointed from, it was a Clinton administration, I think. I think his name was Ira Milstein at the time. He led the delegation, and there was a bunch of institutional investors, maybe one or two U.S. pension funds, like public pension funds, had sent their person over. And I knew all the guys on the other side of the table. I had met all the CEOs on the other side of the table many times. I don't think anybody on my side had met them before.
Yeah.
So I saw both sides immediately. I felt like our side, the IFC side, was kind of lecturing them about corporate governance, almost in an unintentional, condescending way. About, don't you want to do this? Don't you understand this? Like, and the other guys are like dealing with the realities of investing in Russia and running a company.
Yeah.
And what's the gentleman's name who used to run, the Georgian guy who used to run Uralmash? Kaha.
That I know who you mean, but I can't quite bring it up. Yeah.
We're gonna find his name. He was a big man, both physically and in presence, and he was extremely smart.
Yeah.
And he told me, so in the meeting, they were going through all this. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? He spoke fluent English as well as Georgian and Russian, but he decided to speak Russian because he was annoyed.
Yeah.
So he basically said, "I know you guys would like to come here and teach us heathens how to eat with a fork and knife, and just to make sure we brush our teeth the right way. But I'm running this company in the Ural Mountains. My deputy CEO was shot in his car last month. We have mafia guys trying to get control of the company. We have all these things, lack of law. I can't find a replacement for this deputy CEO. I wonder why. And I actually have audited quarterly reports. And my share price is still pennies on the dollar where it should be to reflect the massive amount of output at my company. And I have a corporate governance code. And we tried to get a foreign investor on the board of directors. We have an independent auditor, and he just boom laid it on the table. And I totally identify with that. They were sick of being lectured by each new wave of people that didn't do their homework to be ready for prime time for the Russian side. And that's what disappointed me. I felt like we just had endless waves of newbies from the West coming over, and the Russians eventually just tired of it.
Yeah. I remember there was a sort of stop telling us how to live. That was sort of the shorthand for that sort of backlash that developed, right? So
And I could understand it because I felt we go and ask a bunch of questions, and then I don't know if I got it from a colleague, but at the end of the meeting, we'd always stop and say, "Do you have any questions for us?" And
Yeah.
they were blown away. They're like, "Wait, really?" So yeah, I do actually like. And they'd have a bunch of questions, but they said, many people don't care to even ask. You just come and interview us. In South Africa, the CEOs would say, "Yeah, you Yanks come with your notebooks and never your checkbooks."
Ah, yeah.
And I thought that was really funny. So um, I, after knowing the same people over and over again and coming, I felt like we could ask tough questions, but they'd know where we're going, and we could be kind of back and forth with it. Because of the level of involvement, I was allowed to have one from my firm saying, "You do what you need to do to get an investment view."
Yeah.
And my interest in it, finding competitors in the market who were similarly interested in getting governance things going. We kind of allied to do meetings with the government sometimes, and it culminated at one point with a meeting with Alexander Voloshin, the chief of staff of Yeltsin and Putin for a few administrations. He was the chairman of the board of UES. He ended up being the chairman of the board of a couple of the companies where the government still had a significant stake. And we special pleaded to him about, like, we'd like you, the government, as a shareholder, to be aligned with us as minority foreign shareholders to make sure the company's not selling assets at depressed prices until they realize reforms. So what Tobias wanted to do was, he's like, you know what, we're not getting investment in these little regional utilities.
Yeah.
So we're going to sell them to whoever the largest guy in the region is. So we're going to sell this one to Norilsk. We're going to sell, actually Norilsk had their own, this one to this oil company, this one to this combinat. And those guys are going to be interested in investing electricity capacity so they have dependable and a good enough output to run their things. And in fact, to get it off the balance sheet at a depressed price, so be it. In the end, we'll have a higher share price and we'll have reformed the Russian energy system. So that's a valid approach, the Chubais creative destruction approach.
Right.
But if we're holding the company, we're like, look, UES is a holding company, and it's got really depressed prices because nobody knows what's going on underneath it. There's this risk of asset stripping. So we just went to the government and we said, we just want you to be aware of it, and maybe you have a say on it or a vote on it so we could know. So there was some contentious meetings with Chubais in the Kremlin for many hours. Like, we were there till midnight at one point because Voloshin thought it was very interesting. He was coming up to speed on what was going on. Like, who are these weird foreign investors? Why are you all in your 20s? And Chubais on the other side, who was both an ally but maybe also a pain in the neck from the government's point of view. And how can I use this group to make him do what I want? It was very interesting. And Voloshin agreed to a subsequent meeting a couple of months later to say, like, let's follow up on this. He never went against Chubais, but we felt things were aired, and we knew people better understood where we were. So the reason I bring that anecdote was that you really could get a lot of excellent access and insight if you put the energy into it. You didn't always win, but you could get your case across. And in some cases, you did make a lot of money in the shares of these companies, where it was Gazprom or Norilsk for sure had multiple returns, like 200 or 300% if you bought it at the right time.
Yeah.
Maybe in a subsequent conversation over a beer, maybe the whole issue with Gazprom GDRs versus local shares. I spent a huge amount of time on that, dealing with government officials, Gazprom employees, local brokers on the whole discount rate between the two, and then it created this whole gray scheme market where a lot of skullduggery happened.
Yeah, I do remember some of that as well. So, what did Fidelity get involved with Gazprom shares?
Yes, we could only buy the GDRs. And what was interesting, I remember our spreadsheet I built for the company, the capital structure Russian government agreed to ring fence. I think it was eight. I'm going to make this up. I think it was 8% of the company's free float.
Yeah.
Would be ring fenced in the GDR structure that foreigners could buy. And that share price had nothing to do with the local share price that was on the market, as you recall. So if you got excited about Gazprom, the GDR could trade at a 100 to 200% premium to the local share.
Right.
So, but if you wanted exposure to Russia and it was going well, you bought it. So a lot of people played this game about like doing this. And I remember some of my clients, the portfolio managers, say, well, why would I pay 100% premium for something? And I'd say, well, look, you do the same thing in Taiwan. You buy Taiwan Semiconductor ADR shares, even though you can buy the local shares. When the U.S. tech market rallies, for some reason the ADR would go up faster and higher than the locals because U.S. investors were buying them, and there's only a fixed pool in Taiwan. So the premium would go from like 5% to up to 20% sometimes for no reason. So like you do that without arbitraging. So in this case, you are prohibited from buying the local share.
Right.
So then as that whole thing reformed, and more shares became available, people had like multi-legged returns on the local shares. And then there was, of course, all the issues with the Russian government tolerated for a long time foreigners buying the local shares when they weren't supposed to. I mean, the law said no foreign investment.
Right.
And they knew what was going on. And so I always tell people, you think it's an authoritarian government or totalitarian, whatever you want to call it. They actually tolerate foreigners breaking the law, and because they're bigger fish to fry. So when you get your hand slapped, you knew full well what you were doing.
Right.
And these great, and brokers tried to sell us the gray schemes all the time. And I would just say, absolutely not. We just cannot. We're not going to get fall afoul of any rule where someday it could come back and you get the shares confiscated. There'll be some tax penalty you didn't know about, and then you could be prohibited from investing. Right. So I felt more akin to the Russian side of it in that part. But a lot of hedge funds that we invested, on the same side of the table with, they didn't care if they could buy local shares. They made giant returns.
Right.
Even if they were selling to U.S. investors at the end of the day, they could do things we couldn't do.
Yeah. I do remember that. And then GKOs, were you involved with GKOs?
Thankfully, no, because they blew up spectacularly. We did at one point, I think, in Turkey when they had a financial crisis, some of their short-term 3-month T-bills were yielding 200% or greater.
Wow.
We did buy some of those because they had very short-term maturities, but the GKO market, I think some of my colleagues, the more riskier ones, wanted to, but we just weren't able to, and I'm glad at the end of the day we couldn't. We stuck to Minfin bonds, the Euro bonds, the Vinesh debt, and corporate bonds when they became available. But the GKO market was just a crazy thing to watch.
Yeah. What did 1998 do to you? What was your impact of that on you?
So it's interesting. I had both mentors and managers along the way who were very helpful and good relationships. And I had moved from being a debt analyst on Russia. I had joined the equity side of the business. So I now was looking at companies. And I came into the London office on Monday morning, August 16th or 17th, what it was.
Yeah, 17th was it.
Saw the news. And it was like 8 o'clock in the morning in London. So I picked up the phone and called our emerging markets debt manager, John Carlson in Boston, who I had worked for in the debt team. And then I kind of left his team to join the London equity team, which it was mixed emotions because I kind of left my boss, but he was a larger than life Greg, and we're fantastic friends still to this day. And I called him and woke him up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was like shaking when I called, and he picked up the phone. And I said, "John, it's Bob." He's like, "What happened?" I said, "The Russians devalued, defaulted, and declared a debt moratorium." And I think he got some expletive, and he's like, "Thank you for calling me. I'll call you back. Keep me updated." And then he got up, went downstairs, started calling a bunch of some London brokers, and was trading before Boston guys came in. So we were very lucky that we had a global firm that he could do position the portfolio in some ways, kind of get ahead of the thing. But we just sat there in shock because that whole summer I had been meeting with like some people from Goldman Sachs who were like the economists on Russia that got pulled over the Chinese wall to help. You remember there was one last Eurobond that Goldman Sachs arranged to kind of bridge the Russian debt situation. I'm not sure if Soros had at that time also had a personal loan. I may be mixing up the years.
Yeah.
But the argument was the West is not going to let a nuclear tipped superpower going to go into default. They're going to help them.
Right.
And so much for that edict.
The theory, yeah.
But Russia did get caught up in the crisis began in the East. So we had the Thai baht collapse. It broke its band, and this emerging markets waves of default stemmed from U.S. Monetary policy being very tight at that time, and it drained kind of a global dollar liquidity. And all the regimes that had pegged or managed their currency against the U.S. dollar, liquidity and access to finance was draining, and they abandoned their peg. So it started in Asia. I think it was Thailand and one other country, and then Indonesia probably got hit at the time as oil prices were going down. Also came through Eastern Europe. The Czech koruna came under pressure. The Russians devalued, and all that. So that set off an acrimonious set of relationships from the West to Russia. And I remember Chubais, when we talked to him later, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he was like, I'd do it again if I had to. We had no choice. But they had that meeting. Was it the young guy? His last name starts with a K. He looks like he's always a youthful guy. He was Prime Minister
Kirienko.
Kirienko. He was in the meeting. Dubinin was in the meeting. Chubais and whoever else. And I think they made the decision, and then I think they told Yeltsin we're pulling the plug.
Yeah.
Right. So that was crazy, but that just led to like a really tough time. We owned Russian debt in the funds, and that caused some serious underperformance. And my boss, John, spent a good 18 months, restructuring the portfolio and getting back to outperforming. But it took a lot of our time, as with other competitors. The emerging markets debt crisis of those years, we mark the emerging markets investment calendar by which crises, but births of our children and when they correlated with crises that happened.
Yeah. So did it cause you to then stay out of Russia for those 18 months?
No, I definitely went back and met with people for sure, and other countries in the region also where things happened. So we definitely still stayed engaged. It was to try to find out what was going on. Of course, the devaluation completely resuscitated the oil sector, because when oil prices collapsed, it was pegged to the dollar. It became really, really expensive to purchase equipment in rubles pegged to the dollar and to pay people at a low oil price. And you remember the oil prices fell to like $8 or $9, whatever.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes.
Front page of the Economist, drowning in oil. My oil colleague had it on his door. The minute they devalued, suddenly the Russian oil companies could purchase equipment, earning dollars, and could pay devalued rubles to buy new oil equipment and to pay people. So they flourished.
Yeah.
And once they came back online, then the government could start to earn, tax revenue, and then that whole process of rebuilding their financial system based on that took place. So they were so equities definitely were in a better situation when you could earn foreign priced asset revenues and then pay people with your liabilities would be in Russian rubles.
Right. Did you pay a lot of attention to oil prices when you were looking at your Russian debt and equity evaluations?
Definitely. I spent a huge amount of time meeting with either oil analysts at brokerage firms or the Cambridge Energy Research Group. Thane Gustafson, who's a very interesting character there. His team were very good at Sierra. we developed contacts with the economics teams at oil companies. My U.S. and European developed market colleagues would have good relationships with the big CEOs of energy companies. We tried to find out what their insight was. We often had better insight than they did, though. It was very interesting. Especially, I remember having a conversation we had with when John Brown was running BP, and I felt when oil prices were going up, that over 100 at one point. I messed this up, but he was like, oil prices have always been at inflation adjusted $19 per barrel. That's where they'll go back to. And so we're not wasting any time. Like something as flippant as that. Obviously, he wasn't an oil guy.
Yeah.
He had a different background, but we felt sometimes the oil majors just didn't have any better insight than we did. And what we spend our time with, though, is finding out what the sensitivities to these companies were. And if you got that right, we made a lot of money or avoided losing a lot of money. So in our models, we'd figure out if the local currency devalued in this matrix, and you could build these great little Excel models, a 5 to 10% devaluation added this much to the bottom line. Above this, it was destructive to the balance sheet if they had dollar debt, but it caused this much of a revenue bump. And then the same thing on the commodity price. So it was really fun to learn as an analyst and as we train new people to have them go through this exercise. Like you're investing in a company that they don't control the price of their commodity, but they're geared to it. And if things were both moving in the same direction, like the ruble would go down when the price went up, giant returns. And then people really appreciated the different levels of sensitivity that these companies had. So I spent a lot of time, and it was interesting, the history of it, the politics of it, the fight over the pipeline routes. I met a number of ex-KGB people. Well, the brokerages hired a lot of ex-KGB people, by the way, so they would have their connections. And you'd meet, I'm sure, U.S. spooks in the region that were like the ambassador to the pipeline stuff, or some guy at an embassy who was an attaché who joined your meeting and looked like he left Washington in the 1970s and hadn't gone back. But fantastic access. We got to meet ambassadors and their assistants, and anybody who had a view, we could go interview them, and it was really wonderful to do.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. And there was a question I wanted to ask you there. So you were doing your independent analysis, but your purchases, were through brokers, local brokers.
Some European and U.S. brokers, and they had a twins counterpart. So one example would be Credit Suisse had their European and U.S. desks, and then they had a local entity, so we could purchase through Credit Suisse.
Yeah.
UBS ended up having a partnership with Brunswick. So UBS Warburg had their Russian Brunswick. Deutsche Bank and United Financial Group. Where we could, we had independent relationships with local brokers, so we could trade directly with them. Because often they had the better research. They had the young, interesting analysts on the ground. And to pay them, you wanted to have a trading relationship. Like you gave us all this, you helped us, get this meeting set up. You have good research. The relationships that are developed between mutual fund companies and Wall Street research are very regulated in terms of what you pay for, disaggregated, which is great.
Yeah.
But in places we couldn't. Actually, Fidelity had a system where we could actually cut a check for research. So we got like an internal budget to pay for emerging markets. So if you had like to broker in Russia, I could allocate on a quarterly basis a monetary amount that broker could use with trades with a Western broker. So it was like a system, like almost a barter system that was set up so that we could remunerate people for good access and research. But they were always frustrated. They're like, we appreciate the payments, but like we'd rather have a stable trading relationship. Well, like of course you would, but
right,
it's not going to happen right now.
Yeah.
But we had a very rigorous back office. We'd send our back office teams to go meet with the brokers, and each broker had to be rated internally in terms of their balance sheets, their sustainability, And if our custody guys are like, absolutely not, you can talk to them and send them a check for research, but we can't trade with them. They're too small, no balance sheet, stuff like that. So it was helpful to have a really good team.
Yeah.
To rely on.
Did you have an office in Russia?
No, London, Hong Kong, and Boston.
Okay.
Basically, and so we had a distribution office in Frankfurt, but there was no research there at the time. And now we have offices in Korea, Taiwan, smaller ones. Actually, the sister company, Fidelity International, or now called Fidelity Worldwide, they probably have more offices, but at the time, we did all of our research and investing out of the London office.
So trying to we're at about an hour and a half into this. And
I have time if you don't have another meeting.
Okay, I don't. Okay. I just want to make sure we're okay.
Yeah, and then we could do a follow-up one on Zoom or by email, whatever's easier for you too.
Yeah. I probably would like to do that, but I want to, look, you saw this, you got past 1998, you stayed involved in the market, you stayed involved in it for some period of time after that. Did Russia develop more or less as you expected, or and I'm not talking about the politics. I'm really talking about how the markets, the inner relationship of Russia with the world market, and it becoming what we used to call a normal country, which is their aspirational goal from the beginning was, I want to live in a normal country.
Yes. Wow, that's a good set of questions to think about, because I feel there was like I don't mean reflexive in the Soros sense of reflexivity, because I never really quite understood that whole proposition, but the reflexive nature of our involvement with them, that theirs with us. And you made the reference that I'm glad you did about, we had advisors on the ground trying to get Yeltsin reelected there, and it was okay and open.
Right.
And it's almost like we're like looking at a mirror with each other, or yin and yang, the Russians and the U.S. There, and I feel like that's what causes a lot of the enmity between the two.
Yeah.
When we hit the 2008 global financial crisis, and the world came to a standstill in December, where the banking system seized up. I was getting calls from the guys at Lukoil, and they're like, we can't get a letter of credit on oil in the pipeline right now. The asset's there and can be we just sitting in the pipeline. What is going on? What are you guys thinking? Like, they were turning to us with as many questions and frustrations as the way we were asking them questions.
Huh.
They realized that the Russian financial system and saving system was way too shallow. They looked at China with kind of aspiration and fear. I think that the Chinese system may be fake in some ways in terms of the allocation of capital from the Chinese government into state-owned entities and keeping zombie companies alive. But despite that, there's a deep savings pool that really can't escape the country very easily.
Uh-huh.
And so when the crisis hit, they had domestic liquidity. The Russians didn't. And that thin market wiped out. The banks went to the wall, and a lot of them had to go to the government for bridge loans, of which some got paid back. Some might have resulted in stakes to the government. So they were very alarmed by this. And I think they were like, we need to get our act together. Is Nebulina still the central bank governor?
Yeah.
She was fantastic. I got to meet her once or twice and a couple of her deputies. I thought she was market savvy and very good. And she was there when they were trying to build up the kind of reforms that would help the deepening of the financial system there. Then they also realized, as the U.S. became political on certain things, like the sanctions that came from the Magnitsky Act and other things that precluded Russian companies from issuing new shares, that we were putting them at risk. So Sberbank could not issue any new shares that foreign investors could buy. They could do it in the domestic market.
Right.
So we were actually putting them at a national security risk. Yeah. And I think they're like, we can't have the U.S. turning SWIFT on and off with us. This doesn't make any sense. We have a relationship with Iran. We developed their civilian nuclear infrastructure. We're getting hit by stuff, or we have to join these sanctions. Well, our export industry is going to build these things in Iran. We don't want them to have weapons either. So just seeing it from both sides, I think the Russians got a wake up call. Like, we keep dancing with the West, but they just don't really care about our perspective on this. And when so I think they really tried very hard to figure out how can we use this window of being shut off from the world to develop local industries. And in a good way, food production industries flourished, and the retail sector, the stuff you're more familiar with from experience. And I'm not sure how deep the financial system is now, but they kind of understand the situation. They floated they got away from having the ruble be fixed. They let it float against oil prices, which makes a lot of sense. They've built up gold reserves, and they have a better buffer. And I think they're more practical in how they budget things. So I think it's like a spurned relationship, but they seem to be okay with it. And the problem is, I think the West doesn't care to listen to what Russia has to say. Unfortunately, the late Professor Stephen Cohen, I didn't realize he died last year, the year before. He was
just last year, I believe. Yeah.
He was pilloried with a lot of criticism. He was some apologist for Putin, and all he's ever been is an honest, critical analyst or whoever's in power. Yeah. I learned a lot from reading him. I developed a relationship with former ambassador Jack Matlock, who was Reagan's ambassador, to get his longer-term perspective to understand these things. I had a chance in a forum to meet, a meet and greet with Mikhail Gorbachev when he spoke at the anniversary of perestroika in the U.S., where Colin Powell showed up, and Madeleine Albright, and all these people. They were actually friendly. Uh-huh. The enmity grew and grew. The Magnitsky Act thing kind of poisoned the whole thing, and I have very mixed views on the whole thing, which we can share offline, and see what your thoughts are too, because it's not particular to the interview, and but it matters in terms of where the Russians go from here. And if people took the time to read the speeches or the presentations that Putin gives every year at the not the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the
Valdai,
the Valdai.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with his worldview, he actually explains it, and then he gets challenged by European leaders that ask him questions. They're not stage questions either. He said Genscher has asked him questions, or Dominique Villepin.
Right.
They're not asking canned questions, and over time he expounds a little bit on what's the zeitgeist of the world and what's happening. And I felt like if we just listened a little more, that would be good. So we really should have a lot better, easier, less heated relations with Russia. If we ever get there, I'd be very happy for it. And I think the Russians realize that ship is not maybe sailed, but is elusive, and they just better be prepared to whatever wind is blowing out of the U.S. at any particular time, that they better brace for it, and just make sure they can go it alone, so they don't have another financial crisis.
Yeah.
So nothing's been lasting in terms of what the Russians took away from their whole the IMF years, let's call it, is oh my God, what were we doing? We spent so much energy and effort and destroyed our financial system multiple times for our own mistakes, as well as getting involved. What did we learn from all that? I'm not sure they'd have many positives, except the U.S. changes its emotional state towards us on such a regular basis that we don't know what's coming next.
Yeah.
They're probably more sanguine, realistic, pragmatic. You seem to have as many Russian friends as I do. They're just nihilistic on one day, but nonplussed the next.
Right.
And they're different. And I feel sometimes uh, a Russian friend of mine or somebody said it might be better if Russians were little green men, because this way you wouldn't look at us and say we look the same. We're should be European people the same, but we're actually not. We're as Asiatic and Slavic, and you look at us and you expect us to be one way, but we come from another, and we do have certain overlapping, uh, you know, values. And Voloshin asked this once when he came to Boston for a meeting, and I took a meeting with him, and he was like, "Why do you doubt that we want to become like a normal functioning European style democratic system with our own baggage, but that's not a bad, like, why do people constantly doubt that?" And he seemed
Right.
genuine in asking that. And so they said, if we look like little green men, then you just think like, oh, you act the way we are because you're not like us.
Right. Right. And no, I've heard that several times from different people that the biggest mistake Americans make is because Russians look like us, that we assume they think like us.
Or they ought to.
And they ought to. Yeah. Okay. But that's a different level.
But the one that they do, and then when they don't, we're like, well, how could you not? You should.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Like one time, I took some colleagues to do a trip to Ukraine, an investment trip, and we went to Kiev, and then we went to the east, to Donetsk.
Yeah.
And so we're in Kiev. I took people around, and I'm like, okay, you see the way the people look, the men and the women, the style, the streets. It seems like a little more poor Poland or something, but it feels a little more similar to what you'd expect. You see the onion domes and all that stuff. Go to Donetsk, you land. The men are all wearing leather jackets and jeans. They squat on their haunches when they're waiting for the bus.
Yeah.
And in the same country, you have like a difference in this. So like these are Asiatic Slavs.
Right.
They're different. And then when you meet them, the level of like male machismo is a Russian version of the machismo that is just there, whether you like it.
Yeah.
And so, it's on the table there. So you expect them to just be different. I know a lot of strange cultural shocks by experiencing people in different places in Russia. Many of them are super warm and friendly. And when I could learn to speak a little bit, or I thankfully went with people who spoke excellent English and were good translators, a lot of very kind people. Like they'd one time we were going up to Norilsk and the plane was delayed, and we got there like 2:00 in the morning, but the hotel had prepared a meal for us, because that's what you do when people come in late. And they stayed up and had wrapped up the dinner to make sure we had something. And like half the people were like, oh, I'm just going to bed. I remember this really gentleman, English investor from the UK. He's like, well, I'm going to sit down. They bothered to prepare this and stay up. I'm going to tuck into this. And I said, I'll join you. I think it's totally correct. And I felt that personal level with the many Russian people, that they were really would share everything with you. And then people would say, oh, aren't you scared to go to Moscow? Like, you can't do anything. And I'd say, what are you talking about? Like, we'd go to a restaurant after a long meeting, and it would be like midnight and it's closing, and you'd go and you'd say, come on, we're hungry. And they'd look and say, okay, an hour. And they'd open back up, and they'd bring you fresh ashtrays, and you try doing that anywhere in the United States. Like, it's closed. Get out.
Yeah. And close, go home. Yeah.
One time I had to get to the airport. I was missing my plane, and the driver that I had arranged through the brokerage, he kept saying, what time's your flight? And I wasn't going to make it. And he just said, do you mind if I get you there? And he pulled out in the opposite direction of traffic and zoomed along and passed like a couple miles of cars until he passed a cop car, and he pulled back in, and we got pulled over. So he pulls over and he goes, moment. He goes back, has a chat, gets in the car, has a chat. He comes back, and I asked him, like, what happened? And they said, what the hell are you doing? Like, what are you in a rush for? He's like, I have a client that he's trying to catch his flight back to London, doesn't want to miss it. And they're like, okay, all right, 20 ruble fine. Like,
Yeah,
just be careful. Like,
yeah,
they actually, like, in that instance, it wasn't like shake them down for something. And I said, can you imagine in the U.S. you lose your license, they leave, they impound your car.
absolutely.
Not that you should be doing it, but that it was a different level of freedom. It
Yeah,
was
yeah,
crazy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, all true, all true. I've had many similar experiences. And um, yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, and those are the hard things to explain. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, if a Russian person is your friend, they'll do anything for you. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and because that's what they expect you'll do for them. You
Yeah.
know.
I felt we had very good access to information because we cared to ask questions and listened also. So it's not that we had better information than the intelligence agencies or governments. We had different information that sometimes helped us get to the same uh, quality of analysis that helped us because they were cut off from all the ways that we could have access. And of course, I didn't care so much about some secret cable. I could go and meet 3 oil companies in the same day and hear the information that they didn't know between themselves.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
sometimes it will like, wow, I just heard something that maybe they'll meet over drinks one day, but the Yukos guys don't really want to talk to the Lukoil guys.
Right. Right.
They were
Right.
they were on the same street on opposite ends. Like Menitev had this horrible building that they bought that Rekowsky put Yukos into. And I remember we met with the Yukos guys, then walked down the street. There's a restaurant in the middle, had lunch, and then went to the Lukoil guys, and they were like, "Oh, those guys," and like all this stuff. And I realized they're not talking to each other all the time, but we're getting some really good information. We could put a mosaic together
Right.
of insight, and it was very very good. A lot of contentious meetings, a lot of Russian history and philosophy put in there. You
Yeah.
Americans think you know so much,
Right.
like your NATO is bombing the world. What are you doing in Serbia? And they were right on some of these things. Like
Right.
um, for the long run,